Hi, I'm Ajit Leni. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series part 16. We've been looking at the six-layer framework for establishing enterprise architecture practices. And the last few weeks, we've been looking at the architecture domains layer. And the last couple of weeks, we looked at the information architecture and we completed the information architecture in the last week. Now we will be looking at the application architecture. Right. So coming to application architecture, what are the components of an application architecture, right? It's slightly different from what TOGAF defines as an application architecture. So as you saw how it was different on an information architecture perspective, I'll take you through in my concept, how I look at an application architecture, right? So I'm broadly dividing the application architecture into two, like it could be micro components or micro components, right? Macro components are the applications at the macro level, what's the scope of the application and how we interact with each other, right? So depending on what level of depth we are in, right, what level of detail we are covering in that particular layer, we'll be looking at the macro component or the micro component, right? So in this week, we'll go through the macro components, and next week we'll cover the micro components. So on a macro level, I'm defining there are two components. One is the application landscape and one is the functional architecture. So application landscape is primarily defining what all applications we have in the landscape, like the scoping of the applications, the number of applications we want to have, and also how these applications takes care of implementing the business architecture or business requirements, right? And the functional architecture takes care of how the business processes or the business service, which were defined in the business architecture, how they are realized using these applications through some flows, right? It could be any kind of flows we can represent. We'll look at how we can do that. But the purpose of the functional architecture is to capture how we're going to realize the business architecture using the application architecture. And then next week, we'll go into the micro components, which is about each application, how we're going to architect each of these applications. Right? So let's look at the application landscape first. Right? So application landscape is primarily a matrix, a set of matrices, right? How the components we defined on the information architecture, how they map to the application. So an application could be taking care of one or more IT capabilities, or it could be realizing IT services. It could be managing the business objects we define in the information architecture, or it could be realizing the policy object. It could be implementing a couple of policy objects, right? So, and it could be each one of these, or it could be a combination of all this. So it all depends on how organization wants to define the scope of the applications, right? And the scoping of the application has to be through some guiding principles, right? So it has to be guided by something, otherwise it will become chaotic, right? So there will be a set of reference models, right? That would basically define how we're going to scope the applications. We'll look at what are some few samples of the reference model and how they are used in the next slide. Let's quickly look at what application landscape contains, right? So application landscape, as I said, it's a set of matrices. It basically maps the information architecture components to the applications. It could be in any way of mapping. The applications that are required to realize these information architecture components are depends on the organization. So this is based on the organization structure or the operating model of the organization. So all this comes into picture. But eventually, we have to make sure every single information architecture component we define has to be mapped and realized by one or more applications, right? So that we should have the traceability, right? It is the application landscape establishes the traceability between the information architecture components and the application architecture to make sure that whatever the applications we are in or the landscape we are implementing is the full representation of the information architecture, right? Similarly, we looked at how information architecture should be complete and should have the traceability to the business architecture, right? So as we said, the scope of the applications are defined by or guided by the reference model, right? So let's look at some samples of ways we can do the reference models, right? So the reference models, what is a reference model first, right? The reference models basically identifies the application type and how to compose these types of applications to implement or realize the IT services or the business capabilities we are looking for, right? So there are a number of reference models available in the market, and organizations can choose their own customized models, right, based on their needs. I have listed few ways of, just as an example, I just gave 3 ways of typically we look at an application landscape, but the reference models for the application landscape, right? So some of the applications we'll look at as a 3-layer structure where we have a system of engagement, which primarily the UI layer, right? Could be mobile app or a web UI, or it could be a voice portal or whatever. This is a system of engagement. It could have a business layer or the service layers, right? One or more applications that constitute the business layer. And then there will be a system of records, which would be the system that will be managing the business objects, right? Dealing with the persistence, right? That's one way of looking at it. Another way to look at it is some of the organization would build a bunch of parallel stacks, which at the end is integrated at the experience layer, right? If we have a maybe super app which brings all this together, it could be a micro front-end architecture or whatever way we want to bring all the front-end or the systems of engagement together to an integration layer. And then each business service could be a set of components, applications, like it could have its own systems of engagement and a system of record. And there could be some common services which is implemented outside of those portfolios, right? So this is one way of looking at it. The other way is we could have multiple systems of engagement, all having a common back and forth front-end layer, which typically implements all the microservices needed or experience services needed for the systems of engagement. And then below that, the actual business services layer. And then below that, there could be systems of records, right? So these are few examples that are currently in practice. There could be n number of ways we could do this. So it all depends on the organizational structure, the SDLC practices, how we want to drive our SDLC practices, and how the priorities are defined, etc. So all those play a role in defining the reference model, right? The key thing is the reference models. I mean, we could have more than one reference model because there could be complex businesses or larger enterprise where one reference model may not fit the entire landscape. So we could have multiple reference models, but it should not really go beyond 2 or 3. Otherwise, it'll become a chaos, right? So people start defining applications as they wish, right? That should not happen. Right, the scope of the application is guided by the type of the application. So the type of the application, when we define the reference model, we could define the type of the application, like we can say a business layer or a systems of engagement. So that defines the scope of the application, right? What the application is going to take care, right? Say systems of engagement cannot be the same as a systems of record, right? So there are so the scoping limitations has to be applied based on the type of application, right? Reference model should be a stable one, right? Changing a reference model basically means it impacts the entire organization, right? So it needs significant investment and involve operational complexity to move from a reference model to another reference model. So we have to be careful when we define the reference model. It has to be a very stable one. I'm not saying it should not change. I mean, it should change as things evolve, but it should be a fairly stable one so that it doesn't create a lot of chaos often, right? So that's about the application landscape. So we have the reference models, and we first define the reference model at a very basic level, highest level. And then when we go into the next level of detail, we should be able to define the macro level of what are the applications, how and what type of applications and how they compose. We can compose them together to realize the business architecture. Right. Now let's look at the functional architecture. Right. So once we have the application landscape, we want to validate the both the application landscape and the information architecture, because application landscape is basically a realization of the information architecture, right? So we need to make sure the information architecture is complete, right? So we need how we do it. We can do it is take the components from the business architecture, right? Typically the business processes or business services. Take them and look at how these applications, right, and the information components, information architecture components, these applications are realizing. It could be IT capability or an IT service. How are these components of those applications using those? How are we realizing the business process, right? It could be it can be captured as like a sequence diagram, flow chart, system flow diagram, whatever we can. But the purpose is take each business process or a service and capture how that business process is or the business service is realized using these applications, right? And what IT services or IT capabilities we'll be using to realize that, right? So functional architecture, as I said, helps in validating the completeness of the information architecture and identifies if any missing. Suppose if a business process could not be fully realized by whatever defined as the IT services and capabilities, that identifies as a gap, right? We can go back to the information architecture, correct it, and come back, right? All the business, so we should make sure that all the business process defined the business architecture have a functional architecture, right? So that's how we check the completeness of our enterprise architecture, right? We should not have any gaps in that. So once we have the functional architecture and the application landscape, the next exercise we should do, or it would help us to do, is basically defining the portfolio or the application ownership and the portfolios, right? So basically, what is a portfolio, right? It's a grouping of applications that gets aligned to a particular business unit within an organization, right? So the portfolio is basically a set of application owners and also a set of applications, and each application owner has one or more applications, right? And how do we really organize this into a portfolio, right? So it should be the portfolio's scope. First, each portfolio has to be defined a scope, right? The scoping of the portfolio has to be done by, it could be either by the application types we defined, right? It could be, say, we have a portfolio that manages systems of engagement, or a portfolio that manages systems of records, or it could be through the business services. We could say that, oh, everything on a sales, all the applications that related to sales is mapped to one portfolio, or anything to billing is mapped to one portfolio. Or it could be based on IT services or capabilities, right? Say, I have a capability for catalog management. I have a capability for process orchestration. So process orchestration becomes a portfolio. All the applications implement process orchestration could be portfolio, right? So it could be a based on one of these aspects. It could be a combination, but it's all up to the organization, how organization wants to organize itself, and how the structure is in place, and how they want to transform to implement the enterprise architecture, right? So based on the scoping of the portfolio, we identify what applications belong to that portfolio, and then it's just a matter of mapping the applications to the respective application owner, right? So with this summarizing, so we looked at high level of what are the components of the application architecture, what is an application landscape, how to do the application landscape. We looked at few application reference models and came to the functional architecture, right? So all these three aspects, application landscape, reference model, application architecture, and also the final exercise of ownership and portfolio management, completes the macro level application architecture, where we know what applications we need, how these applications are going to be composed together or interact to realize those business processes, and also how we're going to organize these applications into portfolios, right? Next week, we'll look at the micro components of the application architecture.